My girlfriend smiled. I can replace you, every guy wants me already. She expected me to plead, instead I replied, nice. Door's right behind you. I disappeared and watched her crack when she realized she'd lost all influence. Looking back, I should have recognized the pattern much earlier, but when you're living in the middle of it, manipulation can feel normal until someone finally shows you what respect actually looks like. I'm Lucas, 26, and I work as a certified electrician specializing in smart home installations here in Portland. It's steady work that pays well, around $78,000 a year, and I genuinely love the technical challenges of integrating modern automation systems into older homes. My girlfriend Morgan and I had been living together for 3 years in a decent 2-bedroom apartment in the Hawthorne district, splitting what I thought was a partnership but turned out to be me covering about 80% of our shared expenses. Morgan worked as a freelance makeup artist for local theater productions, which sounds artistic and interesting until you realize theater makeup pays maybe $1,500 a month when she actually booked consistent work. Most months, it was closer to $800, leaving me to handle our $1,800 rent, utilities, groceries, and pretty much everything else that kept our life running smoothly. I didn't mind supporting us initially. Relationships require give and take, and I figured her career would eventually stabilize into something more reliable. What I minded was how she weaponized my support during every single disagreement we had. If I wanted to spend Saturday afternoon in my workshop restoring vintage electronics instead of photographing her practicing new makeup techniques for Instagram, she'd pull out her phone and scroll through dating app notifications while saying, "You know how many guys would love to spend time with someone like me?" If I suggested cooking dinner at home instead of trying that new $40 per person fusion restaurant downtown, she'd show me LinkedIn messages from male colleagues who'd apparently take her somewhere nice without complaining about the cost. The replacement threat became her nuclear option for winning any argument, large or small. "I can replace you tomorrow, every guy wants me already," she'd announce with this confident smile that made my stomach clench, knowing I'd end up apologizing for whatever reasonable boundary I'd tried to set. She kept screenshots organized in her phone like ammunition, dating app matches she'd never deleted, Instagram DMs from random guys, even professional contacts who'd probably just been networking politely. Morgan would wave these digital trophies in my face whenever I dared suggest that maybe, just maybe, I deserved some consideration in our relationship. The worst part was how effective it was. For 3 years, I'd immediately backtrack and accommodate whatever she wanted because the thought of losing her scared me more than the constant feeling that I was walking on eggshells. I'd learned to keep my opinions mild, my requests minimal, and my expectations buried so deep I'd almost forgotten I had any. The pattern was always the same. She'd make some unreasonable demand, I'd hesitate or suggest an alternative, and out would come the phone with its carefully curated collection of male attention. "See this guy Marcus? He's a contractor who owns 3 properties and he's been asking me out for months," she'd say, showing me messages that probably said nothing more than, "Hey, how's your week going?" But in her hands, every casual interaction became proof of my replaceability, evidence that I should be grateful she'd chosen to stay with someone as ordinary as me. I started recognizing the signs, the way she'd position her phone screen toward me during these conversations, the satisfied smile when she saw my jaw tighten, the immediate sweetness that followed once I'd agreed to whatever she wanted. It was psychological warfare disguised as relationship dynamics, and I was losing every single battle. The most ridiculous part was that I actually believed her version of reality. I convinced myself that a freelance makeup artist who posted selfies with inspirational quotes was somehow out of my league, that a guy who owned his own tools and could wire an entire house should feel lucky to date someone whose biggest professional achievement was doing makeup for a community theater production of Our Town. Looking back now, I realize I was living like a tenant in my own relationship, paying all the bills while having zero say in how things actually worked, constantly afraid that my lease would be terminated if I dared ask for basic respect or consideration. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening when Morgan stormed into my workshop with that familiar look of barely contained rage that meant I'd somehow failed to read her mind about something important. I was deep into restoring a 1960s Marantz tube amplifier, carefully replacing capacitors that had been leaking for probably 20 years, when she slammed the door hard enough to make my soldering iron jump. "We need to talk," she announced, positioning herself between me and my workbench like a prosecutor about to deliver closing arguments. I set down my tools and gave her my full attention, already mentally preparing for whatever accommodation she was about to demand. "The theater gala is this Saturday night," she began, pulling out her phone to show me some fancy invitation with gold lettering and what looked like a red carpet backdrop. "I'm doing makeup for Rebecca Morrison. She's the lead actress in their new contemporary drama production, and this is absolutely huge for my career. Everyone who matters in Portland's theater scene will be there, including casting directors and agents, and I need you to come as my date and photographer." I felt my stomach drop as I remembered what was happening this weekend. "Morgan, I can't. The electrician union's mandatory safety training is Saturday and Sunday. It's required every 2 years for certification renewal, and if I miss it, I could literally lose my license to practice." Her expression shifted from annoyed to genuinely incredulous, like I just told her I was planning to spend the weekend juggling fire instead of supporting her dreams. "You're seriously choosing some boring work seminar over supporting my career breakthrough? This gala could change everything for me. Rebecca Morrison specifically requested me because she saw my portfolio on Instagram, and I need professional photos of us together at this event to show potential clients I'm serious about high-end networking." I tried explaining that my electrical license wasn't some optional piece of paper. It was literally the legal foundation that allowed me to earn the $78,000 annually that kept our apartment, her car insurance, and her entire lifestyle financially viable, but she was already shifting into full attack mode. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," she said, scrolling through her phone with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd prepared this arsenal in advance. "You never prioritize what actually matters to me. Look at this. Derek, the fashion photographer, has been asking me to collaborate on projects for months. He'd absolutely jump at the chance to escort me to something this prestigious and career-defining." She turned her phone screen toward me, showing messages from some guy with perfectly styled hair, expensive camera equipment in his profile photos, and what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm for her artistic vision. "And Marcus the contractor? The one who owns 3 rental properties? He texted me yesterday asking if I wanted to grab dinner this weekend at that new steakhouse downtown. These guys actually want to invest in my success instead of hiding in a cluttered garage playing with broken electronics from the 1960s. The old me would have immediately caved under this pressure, would have called in sick to my union training and spent Saturday evening taking carefully angled Instagram photos while she networked with theater people who'd probably forget her name by the following Tuesday. Instead, I looked down at the vintage amplifier on my workbench, something genuinely valuable that had been broken and discarded, but was now being carefully restored to its original beauty and function, and felt something fundamental click into place in my mind. "Nice," I said calmly, gesturing toward our apartment's front door with the small screwdriver still in my hand. "Door's right behind you." Her confident, practiced smile froze instantly, like I'd just spoken a completely foreign language she'd never heard before. For 3 solid years, that replacement threat had been her ultimate trump card, the nuclear option that immediately ended any resistance to her demands and sent me scrambling to apologize and compromise. She was so accustomed to watching me panic and backtrack that my calm, matter-of-fact acceptance of her ultimatum seemed to completely break her entire psychological operating system. "What did you just say to me?" she asked, her voice rising in pitch as her brain processed that I wasn't following our familiar script. "You heard me perfectly," I replied, already turning my attention back to the delicate work in front of me. "If you can replace me tomorrow and every guy wants you already like you keep telling me, then go ahead and replace me. I'm genuinely not stopping you." The silence that followed stretched for almost 30 seconds while she stood there staring at me, clearly waiting for me to break character and return to our established dynamic where I'd eventually cave to her demands. When I didn't look up from carefully positioning the new capacitor, she grabbed her designer purse and headed for the door with obvious frustration. "Fine then," she snapped, her voice carrying that sharp edge she used when her manipulation tactics weren't working as planned. "Don't come crying to me later when you finally realize what you've lost. I'm packing my stuff tonight and moving in with someone who actually appreciates having me in their life." I heard the door slam with enough force to rattle the windows, followed immediately by her car engine starting in the parking lot below, but instead of the familiar panic and desperate urge to chase after her that I'd felt during her previous departure threats, I experienced something completely unexpected and surprisingly liberating, genuine relief. Instead of running after Morgan like she clearly expected, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I blocked her on every single social media platform and threw myself into personal projects I'd been neglecting for far too long. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just the absence of her constant complaints and demands, but the deeper quiet that comes when you're not constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next emotional landmine to explode. I slept through the night for the first time in months, waking up actually refreshed instead of already exhausted by the thought of managing someone else's moods all day. I spent that weekend at my union safety training, genuinely focused on learning new electrical codes and safety protocols instead of checking my phone every 10 minutes for angry texts or manipulative selfies designed to make me jealous. During the lunch break on Saturday, I pulled out a notebook and did something that shocked me. I created a detailed monthly budget that didn't include Morgan's expenses. Without her rent contribution that never materialized, her grocery preferences for organic everything, her impulse purchases I somehow always ended up covering, and her constant demands for dinner at restaurants we couldn't afford, I'd be saving nearly $900 every single month. $900 that I could actually invest in my future instead of subsidizing someone else's fantasy lifestyle. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of our 3-year relationship, I'd basically handed her the equivalent of a decent car or a substantial emergency fund, all while being told I wasn't doing enough. I called my childhood friend Tyler on Sunday evening, something I'd been meaning to do for months but never found the time between work and managing Morgan's emotional crises. "Dude, I thought you'd disappeared off the planet," he laughed when he heard my voice. "When's the last time we actually hung out without your girlfriend monitoring every conversation?" I realized it had been almost 2 years since Tyler and I had spent real time together, mainly because Morgan always found reasons why my friends weren't sophisticated enough or interesting enough for her social media aesthetic. Tyler had been asking me for months to help him start a vintage electronics restoration service. He had the business sense and customer connections from his job managing an upscale furniture store, while I had the technical skills to actually repair the equipment. "You know what?" I told him. "Let's do it. I'm ready to start building something that actually matters." We spent the next week meeting after my regular job, planning our side business with the kind of enthusiasm I'd forgotten I was capable of feeling. Without Morgan's constant interruptions and demands for attention, I discovered I had energy for creative projects, time for meaningful conversations, and space in my head for actual ambitions beyond just surviving another day of emotional manipulation. The change in my work performance was immediate and obvious. Without the constant stress of wondering what crisis would be waiting for me at home, I found myself genuinely excited about complex installation projects. I landed a major smart home integration job for a tech executive's custom-built house, something that required the kind of detailed attention and innovative problem-solving that I'd always enjoyed but rarely had the mental bandwidth to fully engage with. My supervisor actually commented on how much more focused and creative my solutions had become. Meanwhile, Morgan's social media presence exploded with what could only be described as digital desperation. Even though I'd blocked her on everything, mutual friends would occasionally mention her increasingly frantic posting schedule. Apparently, she was sharing cryptic inspirational quotes about ungrateful people and knowing your worth when others don't, along with dramatic selfies captioned with things like choosing myself and grateful for the lesson. The posts were coming multiple times daily, which told me everything I needed to know about how well her supposed abundance of replacement options was actually going. She was shouting into the void, hoping I'd eventually break and look at her content, but I'd learned something important about manipulation: it only works if you're paying attention. The most liberating realization was discovering what my apartment felt like when it was actually mine. Without Morgan's constant need to document every moment for social media, I could eat dinner without stopping to photograph it from 6 different angles. I could watch a movie without pausing every 10 minutes for her to respond to messages from her alleged admirers. I could work on my restoration projects without being interrupted by demands to help her create content or drive her to some networking event that would supposedly launch her makeup career into the stratosphere. For the first time in years, I was living my actual life instead of performing in someone else's social media narrative. When I maintained complete radio silence for 10 straight days, Morgan launched what could only be described as a calculated psychological warfare campaign designed to trigger maximum jealousy and regret. Through mutual friends who still followed her on Instagram, I learned she'd begun posting elaborate date content with different men almost every night, expensive wine tastings at downtown galleries, exclusive restaurant openings with perfectly plated artisanal dishes, weekend trips to coastal resorts with scenic ocean views and luxury hotel amenities. Every post was strategically crafted to showcase the high-end lifestyle she claimed I'd never been able to provide, complete with captions about finally being treated like a queen and grateful for men who understand my worth. The most obvious manipulation tactic was how she started leaving her phone conspicuously open around our apartment during the few times she came by to collect random belongings she'd suddenly remembered were essential to her survival. I'd walk into the living room to find her device positioned perfectly on the coffee table, screen illuminated with a constant stream of messages from guys with names like Jackson, Bryce, and Phoenix, each one apparently offering expensive experiences and lavish gifts that were clearly meant to demonstrate what I was missing out on by letting her go. The transparent desperation of it all was almost impressive in its complete lack of subtlety. But instead of feeling the intended jealousy and panic, I was busy experiencing something entirely different, the rush of building something meaningful with my own hands and brain. Tyler and I had officially launched our vintage electronics restoration service, and within our first week, we landed our first major client through word of mouth from the furniture store where Tyler worked. A retired professor brought us a 1950s Philco television console that had been in his family for generations but hadn't functioned in over 20 years. The restoration required completely rebuilding the tube circuits, refinishing the wooden cabinet, and sourcing period-appropriate components from specialty dealers across the country. When we finally got it working again, displaying clear black and white images with rich, warm sound quality that modern televisions can't replicate, the professor paid us $2,800 with tears in his eyes. $2,800 for work that felt more like artistic expression than actual labor. I'd never experienced that kind of professional satisfaction from my regular electrical jobs, which were perfectly fine but rarely involved the creative problem-solving and historical craftsmanship that restoration work demanded. The confidence boost was immediate and obvious to everyone around me. The most satisfying moment came when Morgan decided to escalate her manipulation tactics by bringing one of her supposed replacements directly to our apartment. I was in my workshop testing a restored 1960s tube amplifier, fine-tuning the bias voltage on the output tubes to get optimal harmonic distortion, when I heard voices in the living room. Through the thin walls, I could clearly hear Morgan giving some guy named Bryce a guided tour of our place, pointing out all the expensive fixtures and appliances like she was showcasing her own personal achievements. "This is the kitchen where I love to cook," she was saying, which was hilarious considering she'd maybe prepared 5 actual meals in 3 years and usually lived on takeout I paid for. When she knocked on my workshop door, I looked up to see her standing there with a skinny guy in an expensive leather jacket who was obviously uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Lucas, this is Bryce," she announced with theatrical confidence. "He's a filmmaker working on a documentary about Portland's art scene, and I thought you two might have some technical stuff to talk about." Bryce looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else, probably realizing he'd been recruited as a prop in someone else's relationship drama. I gave them both a polite wave, said, "Hey, nice to meet you," and went right back to adjusting the amplifier settings. No jealousy, no anger, no dramatic confrontation, just complete indifference to what was clearly meant to be an emotional devastation tactic. I could practically feel Morgan's frustration radiating across the room as her carefully orchestrated scene fell completely flat, producing exactly 0 of the desperate reaction she'd been counting on to restore her sense of power and control. 3 weeks later, Morgan somehow convinced me to attend her friend Ashley's art gallery opening, claiming she needed moral support for what she described as an important networking opportunity that could finally establish her credibility in Portland's creative community. I agreed mainly because I was curious to see how she'd handle social situations now that her usual manipulation tactics weren't working, and honestly, I thought it might be interesting to see some local artwork while observing her increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. The gallery was one of those trendy converted warehouse spaces in the Pearl District, filled with abstract paintings that probably cost more than most people's cars and wine that tasted like it came from a gas station but was being served in glasses that cost $50 each. Morgan spent the entire evening trying to orchestrate the perfect Instagram content, positioning us strategically near expensive-looking pieces while directing me to hold her purse at precisely the right angle so her outfit would photograph well against the gallery's industrial lighting. The tension became obvious to everyone around us when Morgan's theater director friend, a pretentious woman named Catherine who wore scarves indoors and spoke exclusively in dramatic pronouncements, commented on how different our dynamics seemed compared to previous social events. "You two seem less connected tonight," she observed with the kind of invasive curiosity that people mistake for artistic insight. "Are you planning any major life changes together? Marriage, perhaps, or relocating to a city with more opportunities for creative professionals?" Instead of letting Morgan control the narrative like she usually did, I watched with fascination as she tried to paint me as emotionally unavailable and unsupportive of her artistic ambitions. "Lucas has been going through some kind of midlife crisis," she told Catherine with practiced concern. "He's become obsessed with old electronics and spends all his free time in his garage workshop instead of supporting my career development. I think he's intimidated by my success and networking abilities." Catherine raised an eyebrow at this assessment, probably because she'd witnessed Morgan's actual level of professional achievement, which consisted mainly of posting makeup tutorials that averaged 12 views each. But the conversation took an interesting turn when the gallery owner, a successful businesswoman named Diana who'd apparently built her enterprise from nothing into something genuinely profitable, started asking direct questions about our partnership dynamics. "So Morgan, Lucas supports your makeup artistry financially while you're building your client base?" Diana asked with the kind of straightforward curiosity that successful people use when they're trying to understand how other relationships actually function. That must require significant trust and communication about long-term goals and shared financial planning. I watched Morgan's face flush as she realized that Diana was asking for specifics about contribution and reciprocity rather than just accepting her version of events at face value. "Well, it's complicated," Morgan stammered. "Relationships aren't always about equal financial contributions. Lucas makes more money in his field, so naturally he covers more of our shared expenses while I focus on building my brand and professional network." Diana nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question that made the entire evening worth attending. "And what does your brand development look like in terms of actual revenue generation? Are you seeing measurable growth in bookings and client retention, or are you still in the investment phase?" The silence that followed was absolutely devastating. Morgan had no meaningful answer because her makeup artistry barely covered her personal expenses, let alone contributed to any shared financial goals or professional development. Her theater work was sporadic and low-paying, her Instagram following was mostly other aspiring makeup artists and guys sliding into her DMs, and her networking events were really just expensive social outings disguised as business development. The evening became increasingly uncomfortable when Ashley's college roommate mentioned seeing Morgan's recent dating content online, asking innocently whether she and I were taking a break or exploring some kind of open relationship arrangement. Other gallery attendees started exchanging glances as they picked up on the tension and obvious inconsistencies in Morgan's presentation of our relationship status. By the time we left, it was clear that Morgan's manipulation strategies failed spectacularly when performed in front of people who could see through calculated behavior and ask direct questions about actual substance versus social media performance. The drive home was silent except for Morgan's increasingly frantic text message alerts, probably from her supposed admirers who were offering late-night comfort and validation for whatever sob story she was crafting about the evening's social disaster. After 6 weeks of failed manipulation attempts, Morgan decided to orchestrate her most dramatic and carefully staged exit performance yet, a full-scale theatrical production designed to capture my desperate reaction for posterity and social media vindication. I came home from installing a comprehensive smart home theater system for a tech executive's custom-built house to find designer luggage strategically positioned by our front door like props in a movie set, with Morgan sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, phone mounted on a tripod, live streaming what appeared to be a toxic relationship recovery session to her followers. She was wearing her most photogenic outfit and had clearly spent considerable time on her makeup and lighting setup, creating the perfect backdrop for what she'd titled, "Choosing Self-Respect Over Settling, My Journey to Freedom." Sometimes you have to love yourself enough to walk away from people who don't see your value, she was telling her phone camera with practiced vulnerability, occasionally glancing toward the door to make sure I was witnessing her performance. I've spent 3 years trying to build something beautiful with someone who treats love like a business transaction, who sees my dreams as inconveniences, and who thinks emotional support means paying bills without actually connecting on a deeper level. I stood there for a moment, genuinely impressed by the production value she'd put into this finale, then walked past her staging area toward the kitchen without saying a word. Her voice faltered mid-sentence as she realized I wasn't following the script she'd imagined, where I'd presumably break down and beg her to reconsider her dramatic departure. "I deserve someone who celebrates my ambitions instead of dismissing them," she continued, her voice getting slightly louder as she tried to provoke some kind of reaction. "Someone who understands that real partnership means building each other up, not keeping score of every dollar spent." From the kitchen, I called out calmly, "Want help loading those bags into your car?" The silence that followed was absolutely golden. I could hear her fumbling with the phone, probably trying to figure out how to edit out my complete lack of desperation from her livestream narrative. When I walked back into the living room carrying a glass of water and acting like nothing particularly significant was happening, her carefully constructed confidence began to crumble in real time. "You're really not going to fight for this?" she asked, her live stream apparently forgotten as she stared at me with genuine confusion. "You're just going to let me walk away without even trying to work things out?" I sat down on the couch and looked at her with what I hoped was gentle honesty. "Morgan, you've been threatening to leave for 3 years every time I didn't do exactly what you wanted. You've told me repeatedly that you can replace me tomorrow and that every guy wants you already. I'm finally taking you at your word and agreeing with your assessment." Her phone was still recording, capturing what was supposed to be her triumphant moment of self-empowerment but had turned into something much more uncomfortable and revealing. "But we have history," she said, her voice cracking as the reality of the situation started to hit her. "We've built something together over 3 years. That has to mean something to you." I took a sip of my water and considered my response carefully. "It does mean something. It means I learned that relationships built on threats and manipulation aren't actually relationships at all. You've spent 3 years telling me I'm not good enough, that other men would treat you better, that I should be grateful you're settling for someone like me. I'm finally agreeing with you." That's when her performative confidence completely dissolved into an unscripted emotional breakdown that was probably not the content she'd intended to share with her followers. Through tears that smudged her carefully applied makeup, she admitted that most of her supposed replacement options were either completely fictional or guys who'd stopped responding once they realized she expected them to fund her lifestyle. The elaborate dates she'd been posting were mostly paid for with credit cards she couldn't afford, the expensive gifts were returns from purchases she'd made herself, and the weekend trips were carefully cropped photos from day visits to hotel lobbies and restaurant patios. "I don't actually have anywhere to go," she whispered, staring at the designer luggage that was apparently packed with clothes she'd bought specifically for this dramatic exit scene. Derek, the photographer, stopped texting when I asked him to pay for professional headshots. Marcus, the contractor, blocked me after I suggested he cover my car payment. Even Bryce turned out to be living with 3 roommates and working part-time at a coffee shop. I felt genuinely sad for her in that moment, but also relieved that the truth was finally coming out. Morgan, threatening to replace someone means being prepared for them to accept the offer. Real relationships don't operate on fear tactics and emotional blackmail. She left that night to stay with her theater friend Catherine, but not before sending a series of increasingly desperate texts that I didn't open, having finally learned that any response would only feed her need for control and drama. The live stream she'd intended as a victory lap had turned into a public confession of manipulation and desperation, and I suspected her followers had gotten a very different show than she'd planned to provide. 8 months later, my life looked absolutely nothing like the constrained, eggshell-walking existence I'd accepted as normal during my relationship with Morgan. Tyler and I had transformed our weekend electronics restoration hobby into a genuinely profitable business venture that was booked solid for the next 4 months and had been featured in both Portland Home and Garden magazine and Northwest Electronics Quarterly for our award-winning restoration of a 1940s Zenith console radio that now served as the centerpiece of a luxury hotel's vintage-themed lobby. What started as a way to escape relationship drama had evolved into something that challenged me creatively, paid substantially better than my regular electrical work, and connected me with clients who genuinely appreciated craftsmanship and historical preservation. I'd moved out of the apartment Morgan and I had shared, finding a beautiful craftsman-style house just 10 minutes from our workshop that had been built in 1925 and featured original hardwood floors, built-in bookcases, and a basement that was perfect for my expanding collection of restoration projects. The mortgage payment was actually lower than what I'd been paying in rent, and for the first time in years, I had accumulated real savings, over $7,200 in my emergency fund plus another $4,000 invested in index funds that were steadily growing without me having to touch them to cover someone else's impulsive purchases or manufactured crises. But the most significant change was meeting Jessica, a museum curator who specialized in mid-20th century technology exhibits and had contacted our business about restoring several pieces for an upcoming display about the evolution of home entertainment systems. She was brilliant in ways that had nothing to do with social media followers or Instagram aesthetics, with a PhD in American Studies and the kind of deep knowledge about historical context that made our restoration work feel like genuine archaeology rather than just repairing old electronics. Our first conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from the cultural significance of radio programming in the 1940s to the environmental impact of planned obsolescence in modern manufacturing. And I realized I'd forgotten what it felt like to talk with someone who was genuinely curious about ideas rather than constantly calculating how every interaction could be leveraged for personal advantage. Jessica valued authentic communication over performative social media presence, paid for her own meals without making it a political statement about gender equality, and had actual hobbies that didn't require an audience or expensive equipment I'd be expected to fund. She owned her own condo, drove a reliable car she'd purchased with her own money, and had been saving for a sabbatical year to research American industrial design at archives across the country, goals that were specific, measurable, and entirely independent of whatever man she happened to be dating. The contrast with Morgan's approach to relationships was so stark it was almost educational. When I told Jessica about my previous relationship dynamics, she listened without judgment but with the kind of analytical perspective that comes from studying human behavior professionally. Emotional manipulation through manufactured scarcity is a classic control tactic, she observed matter-of-factly while we were touring a vintage electronics museum in Seattle. Creating artificial competition and threatening abandonment are designed to keep the target person in a constant state of anxiety and compliance. It's actually a form of psychological abuse that's surprisingly common but rarely recognized because it doesn't involve physical violence. Her ability to contextualize my experience within broader patterns of human behavior helped me understand that what I'd endured wasn't unique or particularly subtle. I'd simply been too close to the situation to recognize manipulation techniques that would have been obvious if I'd observed them happening to someone else. Meanwhile, the most satisfying vindication came completely by accident when Morgan unexpectedly appeared at the Pacific Northwest Vintage Electronics Expo where Tyler and I were demonstrating our restoration techniques and displaying some of our most impressive completed projects. I was explaining the complex process of rebuilding vacuum tube circuits to a group of collectors when I noticed a familiar figure standing near our booth, looking genuinely different from the woman I'd dated for 3 years. Morgan appeared more professionally dressed, less filtered and artificially enhanced, working as a makeup department head for a regional theater company that was apparently doing well enough to send her to cultural events as a legitimate business representative rather than someone desperately networking for opportunities that would never materialize. She approached our display with obvious nervousness but genuine curiosity, examining the 1940s Zenith console radio that had won us recognition in the industry publications. "Lucas, this is absolutely incredible work," she said quietly, and I could tell she was seeing my restoration projects with different eyes than she'd had during our relationship when she dismissed them as garage hobby nonsense that took attention away from her needs and ambitions. I introduced her to Jessica, who was gracious and professionally interested in Morgan's theater work, and watched as Morgan processed the obvious contentment and mutual respect that characterized my new relationship. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes, during which Morgan offered a sincere apology for her manipulative behavior and admitted that losing me had forced her to confront insecurities and build genuine professional skills rather than relying on threats and social media validation to maintain relationships and career advancement. I accepted her apology with genuine grace while making it clear that I'd moved forward completely, and as we parted ways, I reflected on how calling someone's bluff had taught me that healthy love doesn't require leverage or fear tactics. Sometimes the best response to, "I can replace you," is simply opening the door and meaning it, because the right person would never make that threat in the first place.